So, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, this is a favorite question of school children everywhere, and even adults can't help but wonder once in a while. Just which one came first? There is an answer, oddly enough, if we think the problem through. Although part of the answer could depend on how exactly you view the egg. Whether you view the egg as an inanimate or abstract thing, or as the living being within. Now, one of these troublesome chicken or the egg problems in the modern world is the question of personal virtue versus social justice. Now, I bet most of us have not thought of it that way, but a virtuous people does not spontaneously arise at the same time as a just society. That is, social justice in action, any more than both the chicken and the egg would spontaneously generate themselves at the same time. One has to beget the other. So let us simplify the question. What comes first, personal virtue or social justice? That is, do good people make good social programs, or do good social programs make good people? Now, there was a philosophy professor, Christina Summers, who wrote an illuminating as well as amusing example of the folly of waiting for good programs before one could be a good person. She had a colleague once who adamantly held that social justice had nothing to do with personal virtue. The colleague said to her, "You are not going to have moral people until you have moral institutions. You will not have moral citizens until you have a moral government." She emphasized her point by berating Professor Summers for wasting her time and even perhaps harming her students by promoting a bourgeois mentality and bourgeois virtues instead of getting them to do something about the oppression of women, corruption in big business, and the evil of multinational corporations. But a curious thing happened at the end of the semester. More than half of this colleague's students ended up cheating on their social justice take-home exams. "So what are you going to do?" the professor asked her distraught associate. "I'd like to borrow a copy of that article you wrote on ethics without virtue," she replied with a self-mocking smile. Now, in recent history, we have a sterling example. The Marxists, on seeing a social injustice, figured out that the way to correct this would be to impose a social justice without a moral foundation, and ended up with something that was neither social nor justice. Men, their passions no longer regulated by a moral code, began to devolve into impersonal cogs in the state apparatus, and only those who were at the very top could truly reap the benefits. Society dissolved into mutually suspicious cliques, since who could trust an amoral comrade? The church and the world at large are locked into the same battle these days. The problem with some in the church, however, is that they assume that social justice is the source of blessing, as opposed to God's blessing, or virtue being the source of social justice. In Scripture, in that famous passage, the swords are not beaten into plowshares, nor are the spears shaped into pruning hooks, until all people come to the knowledge of God and friendship with God in a life of virtue. In today's readings, there is no longer harm on God's holy mountain, quote, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord." The knowledge comes first. The promised Messiah is blessed indeed because, quote, "Justice shall be the band around his waist and faithfulness a belt on his hips." It is a prerequisite that the Messiah be a man of virtue, a man of justice, before he can set up a world of justice, that is, social justice. A just world did not beget the Messiah. The Pharisees and Sadducees have set up a wonderful structure in many ways of justice, of helping their fellow Jews. But this observance is an attempt at social justice without personal justice, without virtue. So it is a sham, a house built on cards. Indeed, perhaps this is their greatest problem with Christ as the Messiah, because he so violently shakes that foundation. They, as I imagine the communists, thought themselves good without truly even understanding what good is. To paraphrase the slogan, no God, no justice. That is KNOW, or the alternative, no God, no justice. That is NO. Pope Benedict XVI reminded us back in 2010 that Christ is the justice of God. Modern man attempts to rid the world of suffering by ridding the world of political and economic inequality without God. To him, sin, if it even exists, is simply a personal question of belief without any real social dimensions or implications. Modern man then wonders why he is so disenfranchised from his fellow man and from his own dignity and meaning. Now, for the Catholic, sin is personal, but it does have social implications. Because to be in sin is to be away from God. To be away from God is to be away from the source of divine love and charity. To be away from divine love and charity is to eventually fall into short-sighted pride and selfishness. Now, this is not to say that the problems are easy. If they were easy, we would have had utopia long ago. Even Pope Leo XIII, the father of modern social justice, in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, at the very beginning warns us that the discussion is not easy, nor is it void of danger. It is no easy matter to define the relative rights and mutual duties of the rich and of the poor, of capital and of labor, and the danger lies in this, that crafty agitators are intent on making use of these differences of opinion to pervert men's judgments and to stir up the people to revolt. In other words, it's easy to riot. Do the right thing takes a lot of work. Beware of those who sell easy solutions. Now, some would say that it is traditional Christian morality which had failed the poor. That is the traditional Marxist critique. Pope Leo XIII answers the critique in the same encyclical, teaching us that, quote, the true worth and nobility of man lie in his moral qualities, that is, in virtue. Christian morality, when adequately and completely practiced, leads of itself to temporal prosperity, for it merits the blessings of that God who is the source of all blessings. It powerfully restrains the greed of possession and the thirst for pleasure. What our critics fail to realize is that without the Church's restraint, probably would have been far worse. The problem is not that there was too much church and too much of virtuous men. The problem was simply that there was not enough. No, as Pope Benedict reminded us in the same place cited above all, justice comes from grace. So how can we increase justice, social justice? Simple answer then is clear. Increased grace. Increased grace in the individual believers, that it may increase in the church, that it may increase in the world, that the world may see Christ in his church and in his believers. This does not mean that we don't work now for fairer or better laws. What it does mean is that we cannot divorce one from the other. Now, what it does mean is we want a better world. We should probably start with better selves. Because it is very easy to pass laws to try to change societies. Our governments passed thousands of laws last year. Are we better? Does it make us better? It's a far more difficult matter to change ourselves first. There is no law that's going to make us. Rather, perhaps we should let ourselves be changed. So come, let us seek the Lord, the root of Jesse, that we may follow him in his ways more closely this Advent. Let us return to the Lord our God, the source of our dignity and worth as human beings, all of us made in his image and likeness. Let us not be dependent on the whims of politics and politicians. Then shall Christ truly be born, not in a manger, but in our hearts, in our society, in our nation, in our world, now. Then, and only then, will there be a world of true justice and peace.